Good morning and welcome again to Zip Over to Zack's. My name's Zack Polanski. I'm the third on the Green Party London Assembly list, supporting the amazing work of our Green Party Assembly members, Sean Berry and Caroline Russell. And before I introduce my guest today, I just want to talk about a little bit of the work I've been up to this week. On this show, we talk about any issue and nothing is off the table. In recent weeks, we've talked about proportional representation. We did a show about representation in the arts. And last week we had what I found an incredibly moving episode on the refugee crisis with former leader Natalie Bennett and Ahmed al-Rashid, a Syrian refugee and academic. This week, we're going to look at it from a slightly different point of view, which I'll come on into a moment. This week, I've been out protesting, actually, and it's almost felt, I don't want to use the phrase back to normal because no one wants to go back to normal. We don't even want a new normal. We want to turn everything around and make everything different. But it did feel like a little bit of a return of some of the things that were good before. I went to the Polish embassy to stand in solidarity with LGBT Polish people to kind of stand against some of the atrocious things that are going on in Poland right now. It was just amazing to be there and be in solidarity with them. And once again, solidarity to the Polish Rainbow organization. I then went with Make Votes Matter to campaign for proportional representation in Westminster, where we dropped a banner saying Make Votes Matter. This was going on all over the UK, people standing and amplifying the voices of fellow electoral reform campaigners. I've gone on about this a lot on the show, so I won't take up too much time on it, but I really do believe, and I'll repeat at any opportunity, that proportional representation is a huge part in dealing with every issue we talk about in this show, including the climate emergency. Of course, we need people out there on the street. We need the climate strikers. We need Extinction Rebellion. But we really need those political parties like the Green Party to be able to get representation in the Assembly, in Parliament, on local councils, so they can be standing and making sure that people are telling the truth. Now, on telling the truth, that leads to our discussion today. Now, a lot of you will have been aware of the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They said we've got 10 years to keep climate chaos to 1.5 degrees. If it goes even half a degree above that, we're going to be looking at irreversible damage to our planet. We're talking about extreme droughts, we're talking about overheating. Some of the things are already starting to happen around the world, especially in the global south, but we're talking about it happening everywhere and even worse in those areas. Some areas will be massively disproportionately impacted. Now, in the Green Party, I'd hope we've largely accepted that and we're working on that. What I really want to talk about today is those extra aspects, those things that are going on in terms of those groups or communities that can do their extra part to help or maybe have disproportionate influence over changing things. So on my show today, I have Jonathan Fuller. Jonathan has been an environmental activist for 30 years. He's worked on Extinction Rebellion's media team, and he's been doing incredible work. I very often see him on Facebook and social media, challenging the media, challenging all sorts of people, and always kind of amplifying people's voices. So pleasure to have you on, Jonathan.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'm also joined by Shulamit Morris-Evans. Shulamit is a member of Extinction Rebellion Jews. I know she goes around and does talks about faith and community groups, and she's been a fantastic voice. She recently did a talk in a Green Party Jewish group where I heard her speak and thought, I really want to hear more from Shulamit, so it's been amazing to give her this platform today. Good morning, Shulamit.
Good morning.
So starting off with Jonathan, I alluded there already to some of the work you've been doing around getting media organizations to tell the truth. I guess, what is the role of the media and why aren't they telling the truth?
Well, I would say that the main thing to remember is that the media is now talking about climate change more than ever before, but it is still not tackling the really frightening and alarming news. And if you allow me, I'll give you a couple of quick examples. Just before the IPCC report was published that you referred to a few minutes ago, the UN Secretary General asked the world's media to attend a press conference that he gave. And at that press conference, he said he'd seen the advanced copy of that report and he wanted to warn the world that we really do now run the risk of runaway climate change. And he said that this is a direct existential threat. Those are the words he used. Now, if we're actually facing a direct existential threat, how can it possibly be that the media hasn't explained how that process occurs? What does it mean? Now, jumping forward to this year, earlier this year, NOAA and NASA are responsible for doing a huge amount of climate research in the United States, and they're considered to be mainstream science organizations. Back about 14 years ago, NASA had done a huge amount of research in the Arctic at the pace with which Arctic ice was retreating. And they said that what we call the Blue Ocean event, when the Arctic is virtually free of all ice in the summer, that would happen in the 2060s. But earlier this year, NOAA said that that projection would have to be brought forward. And they said that their modelling showed that it was most likely to happen in the year 2034 and that it could be sooner. Now, this is incredibly important. A lot of people won't understand this because they just don't hear anything about it on the media. But as soon as the ice is gone, well, when the ice is there, 90% of the sun's radiation hits that ice and is reflected back out into space because it appears white from space. But when the ice has gone, 94% of the sun's energy is absorbed by the ocean, because from space, open ocean appears to be black and just absorbs, like my t-shirt, it just absorbs all the energy, all the heat. So this is a massive tipping point. And if I'm alive then, that will be the biggest tipping point that will actually have occurred in my lifetime. There will be others further down the line, but once you go through that, it's what David Attenborough refers to as a one-way door. You've gone through it, and then there's no going back. And then you've reached a new point where the Arctic will continue to heat, but at a much faster pace. A few years ago, we thought that this level of heating would be much later in the century. Now we know that it could just be 10 or 14 years away. So I think the key point here is that only an emergency scale of response can save the young from utter catastrophe, just a never-ending series of catastrophes, environmental catastrophes that just go on and on, getting worse and worse. If we are to save the young from that, then we need to do things that the Green Party has suggested, which is incredibly dynamic, to try and attempt to decarbonise our economy by the year 2030. That will buy humanity, if you like, more time. Right now, I don't know whether people were aware, but we've just had a very bad wheat harvest in the UK, with the National Farmers Union spokesman saying that he needs the government to take food security more seriously. And he said he wants that moved up the government's agenda. And again, I think to myself, well, how many people in the UK know that the National Farmers Union has just said that? And they're talking about food security here in the UK. You know, they're not talking about it in North Africa. They're talking about it here in our country, that we are not food secure. So again, I would argue that these are truths that the public deserve to know.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Well said. So Jonathan's talked there about the role of the media. If I can turn to you, Shulamit. As I said, I saw you talk at Jewish Greens, and one thing that I was really struck by was you talked about this concept of tikkun olam. Now, being Jewish, I already knew what you were talking about. It would be great if you could outline those for our non-Jewish viewers or even our Jewish viewers who might not know it necessarily. And then what I'm really interested in is, what is the role of faith groups more generally in dealing with the climate emergency?
Yeah, so I think in a way, before I just explain what tikkun olam means, the kind of background to that bit sort of answers the second part of the question, which is to say that, you know, for me, I feel like my ethical life and my Jewish life are inextricably intertwined. And I don't imagine that that's much different for many people of many other faiths, not just Jewish people, but people of all sorts of different faiths. So, you know, you then draw on that tradition to deal with the world around you, and the climate and ecological emergency being one of the rather salient aspects of what's going on in the world around us at the moment, certainly, I think, from a moral perspective. So tikkun olam it means like healing the world, and it's often used to sort of refer to general kind of social action. And I think it, for me, strikes a very poignant, plangent chord when we're talking about the climate and ecological emergency, because it's not just the sort of social action aspect, it's not just the kind of conscience kind of driven activity side of things, it's also the fact that, you know, the world literally needs healing. And it's a message that I think is possibly even more powerful at the moment, when you feel like there are so many kind of rifts and ruptures and soars, there's a literal pandemic going on, and there's also so much division, and that healing in all sorts of senses is what we really need. So that's, Tikkun Olam. And so I think what I just referred to about that deeply personal source of your own convictions, that almost ties into, I think, the part that's hardest to talk about and hardest to put your finger on when you're talking about the role of faith and faith groups in dealing with the climate crisis, because that, that's the bit about faith rather than religion, and that's deeply personal, and what really matters to people, what really drives people, what is at the ineffable core both of people's internal lives and of the way that they perceive the world. That's something you can't really talk about in a way. But I think it is part of what connects to how people respond to this crisis, for sure. And it's been interesting, in fact, as well as my activities in Extinction Rebellion Jews, I've been involved with this grouping called Pivot Projects. It's not a sort of formal organisation as such, but it's a group of engineers and people of faith, all sorts of people from all sorts of professions who sort of came together during the coronavirus pandemic to talk about how could we use this moment to pivot to a more sustainable kind of society. And within the faith grouping, within that bigger conversation, I think there was a real sort of acknowledgement that sort of faith and organised religion kind of can be separated. So that's sort of one thing to say to the question. However, that said, I think that organised religion plays a huge role, and can play, and hopefully will play a huge role in dealing with the climate crisis, because first of all, there's a kind of like deeply practical, logistical aspect of things that organised religion has a lot of land and money and people on their mailing lists and that sort of thing. So there's a sense in which, in terms of mobilizing people, in terms of dealing with the logistics of change, from a purely practical perspective, faiths are going to be really important. And then there's sort of the bit in the middle of not just the like logistics and not the unspeakable kind of, I suppose, spiritual, for want of a better word, stuff, but the sort of helping bridge that and create that transition, bringing people along and, kind of legitimizing change in a way. Because I think one of the things that I've thought about a lot recently is how important community is. I think that was something that came to mind for a lot of people during the coronavirus, kind of the first lockdown and things like that. And, faith for many people is what their community, what their experience of community is built around. So I think that you've got that sort of almost Venn diagram of the, what really drives people, what is the source of people's convictions, the deeply practical aspects of how are you going to affect change, how are you going to organize things, and then the kind of bit in the middle of, what is it that will kind of give people the sense of, okay, this is my belief, and those are the tools that we have, and we can and we should be doing this, and this is kind of the way that we're going to proceed. So yeah, I think that those are some of the sort of key aspects of the way that faith can intersect. And of course, Extinction Rebellion Jews, which I've been involved in, is very much part of that, bringing people in who maybe either people who wouldn't be involved in climate activism, wouldn't be involved in Extinction Rebellion, and bring them in and saying, look, we're part of your community and we're doing this, like, come and join us, as well as creating a space for people who are doing Extinction Rebellion, and can then find people who have something in common with them and to share that space.
A really beautiful answer, thank you. And it's hit out with a lot of complex issues there. It also reminds me of, with the issues of the pandemic, how much localism has become so important recently as well, that people who may have been, so this is a London podcast, in terms of people would be going all over London, but actually we've started to become much more concentrated and get to know our neighbours. So it's lovely to see all of those things starting to kind of come together. Coming back to you, John, so Shulamit there has talked about the issues around faith groups. And faith groups generally seem to be quite receptive to the climate emergency, or certainly it's something that's been intertwined with religion. The media, not so much though. Why do you think they're so resistant to these messages about the climate emergency?
Yes, Rowan Williams has been incredibly strong on encouraging people to join Extinction Rebellion. And that's something that we all must do. We have to stand up. We have to show the courage and get involved now. But as regards to the media, I think that there are a series of forces at play here. Now, for example, the BBC, I've been running a couple of protests over the last 2 weeks there, both at Salford and at BBC Broadcasting House in London. And these are around tell the truth. People deserve to know the truth. And by withholding the truth, you prevent the young from that one last opportunity to defend themselves. I think that for the media, it is often quite conservative. The BBC is very conservative with a small c. It is reluctant to cause alarm or frighten people. But people deserve to be frightened because the truth is frightening. And by withholding information from them, for instance, on food security, for example, some of the really frightening things that are happening in California right now, sure, the forest fires are being reported, but the implications are of that for agriculture in that area and for mass movement of people, that's not being explained by the media anywhere. And I think it's because they're reluctant to cause alarm. Organisations like the BBC see their role as supporting business, so they don't want to do anything that would undermine business. Lord Tony Hall gave a speech a couple of nights ago. He's the Director General of the BBC, and he made a remark that he saw the BBC going forward as the BBC's World Service, perhaps reaching 500 million viewers around the world. He made a number of remarks, but one of them was this idea of promoting British trade. So I do feel that perhaps the BBC is locked into what we call business as usual, a business as usual perspective. And they don't seem to want to perhaps be accused of undermining British business. For example, they don't want to be accused of maybe undermining the British car industry. If people like us in the Green Party would talk about having car-free towns and cities, they may not want to be accused of undermining the aviation industry. Perhaps they typically see that as a job creator, whereas in fact the reality is that in 2019 it lost the UK economy about £30 billion because so many more people were travelling abroad than other nationals were travelling into the UK. It was a net loss of £30 billion to the UK economy. That's thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands of jobs that effectively have gone. Typically it's the example of the people who go away on a pen night or a stag night to Eastern Europe. Previously, they would have done that in the UK, but now they're doing it in Eastern Europe. And that's the kind of thing that impacts our balance of payments. And so it's several factors coming together that limit organisations like the BBC from wanting to tell the public the truth. Because if they were told, it would kind of undermine, they would see it as undermining our entire economy. And they don't want to do that. So there's politics, there's that business as usual perspective, and there's also the fear of causing public alarm. So it's several factors all coming together that prevent the media from telling the truth.
Thank you. And just to add that, Jonathan can often be found outside the BBC, putting his money where his mouth is, so to speak, and protesting. So if you find Jonathan on social media, Jonathan M. Fuller, you can also join in those campaigns, which are crucially important. Coming back to Shulamit, so one thing we've been trying to do for a long time, I think, in the climate movement is to create and maintain credibility around the climate science by presenting the evidence. And I think, maybe naively, we've almost won that argument. Very naive, actually. We haven't won the argument, but we've won the argument among the scientists. We've definitely won that argument. Is there a danger now in mixing religion, which isn't necessarily grounded in science, with these scientific arguments?
I mean, I definitely don't see it as such, and I also feel like, I feel like we've sort of won the argument, and then there are some people who sort of don't really want to hear the conclusion. Certainly as far as scientific evidence and consensus goes. But no, I think that in a way, what I just said sort of is my response, in that I don't think being a person of faith means that you can't look at scientific evidence and evaluate that just as rationally as any other person. So for me, I was informed about what was going on. I had this sort of terrible sort of realization about the dire state things are in, and where faith comes in, as I sort of alluded to in my previous answer, is in what it felt like to respond to that, and how that response is framed for me, not just internally, but also, you know, in how I have responded to it, in the sense of feeling like I kind of almost needed Extinction Rebellion Jews, because that's the way in which I felt I was responding already, was bound up with sort of the principles that I'd been taught, you know, being brought up Jewish. And so I definitely don't, I definitely don't see there as being any conflict. And I kind of almost kind of don't sort of see how there could be. Now, perhaps that's because I come from a certain kind of religious tradition, progressive Judaism. But I think that, you know, perhaps what you're sort of alluding to is kind of, I suppose, religious fundamentalism, where religion, I think it's only in that kind of instance where religion and science can be seen as sort of in some way mutually exclusive. And I would say that for, you know, a lot of people, probably I would say the vast majority of people of faith, that's just simply not the case and not the way life works. So I don't see it as even slightly controversial or counterproductive. I see them as not just in responding to the climate emergency, but just in life as coexisting in an entirely complementary and almost, you know, I think for people who are part of religious communities, sort of necessary and natural way, that those are two sides of your existence, not even two sides, they are intertwined.
I love this answer, because we're complex. All of us are complex as human beings. And I love the idea that we can be so many things at once, and not one thing defines us. It's actually that combination of things. So thank you for the thoughtful answer to a complex question. We're running out of time, as we always are. So I'm just going to turn to a final question to you both. John, really my question is a very open question. It's just, what do you want to happen next, and what can people do to help?
Right, well, I'd urge people to get involved in Extinction Rebellion if at all possible. We're going to have to be very careful this year because of COVID. We've got to respect physical distancing rules, and we have got to be, you know, cautious there. But if at all possible, people should join in Extinction Rebellion actions. And then there are also a stack of actions that people can take at home as well. But I would urge people to really sort of focus upon, going forward, this key element of the equation, which is getting the media to tell the truth. Because the vast majority of people still do not understand just how serious this threat is and how little time we have to avoid catastrophe. There is, no matter what, a lot of pain is already locked in. But we can limit the scale of pain that our children, grandchildren have to suffer, provided we act immediately. There's another element to this, which when I give my talks, I always try to remind people of a key message of our time, which is Black Lives Matter. There are the climate impacts right now primarily impact Black and Asian communities. Around about 400,000 people a year are killed by climate change. And I tell the media and big business and polluting industries and the politicians to get that knee off their neck, because that's 400,000 people killed every year who are virtually all non-white, global South citizens. And it's an outrage that, again, hardly anybody understands that. So please do join with me, link up with me on Facebook, and together we all work hard to get the media to tell the truth.
Thank you for that. There is no environmental justice without social justice.
definitely.
Shulamit, same question to you. What next? How can people help?
Yeah, pretty similar to John, really. And I think what struck me from what he's been saying is the way in which kind of education in the broader sense and sort of information and the role of media in that and empowerment sort of need to be intertwined. People aren't going to understand why Extinction Rebellion is behaving in the way that they are and doing the things that we're doing if they don't understand. And equally, people need to know that sort of it's up to them, or they can have a voice. Otherwise, that information is just utterly upsetting. And I think that comes into why the BBC are maybe reluctant, because part of that is missing in their mental equation. So I think that those are sort of two halves of things that I would like to see in the abstract, people understanding what's going on and feeling empowered to act on it. And of course, as John said, Extinction Rebellion are going to be holding a socially distanced and careful rebellion with regional actions in the last 4 days of August, and then starting on the 1st of September, they've got a climate and ecological emergency bill that we would like Parliament to be debating as they return to sit after the summer. So there's a sort of positive, concrete thing that we're asking them to do, which I think, especially, given the situation we're in, as John has mentioned, is really entirely appropriate. That's what should be top of their agenda, especially as we work out how to extricate ourselves from the mess created by COVID. And we will be, there will be actions going on around Parliament Square. Of course, Extinction Rebellion Jews have a calendar of events planned that may not be applicable to everybody who's listening to this. But of course, you're all very, very welcome. We're there on Facebook. Please do get in touch if you are interested in finding out more, coming along. And to everybody else, please do come along during those first 2 weeks, particularly of September, to Parliament Square and add your voice to, I think, the most important call for change of our times.
Thank you both. You're both incredible advocates for the cause, and we're very lucky to have you. We need everyone advocating, so it's really, really good to hear. I'd just also add to that, on Monday there is a protest, Extinction Rebellion protest, at Stratford Station at 12:30, which is stopping the Silvertown Tunnel. That could be a whole nother episode in its own. In fact, Sean Berry did do an episode on it, which is essentially this horrible 4-lane motorway that the mayor is promising to build, and we need to stop it. So that's 12:30 on Monday. Shulamit, Jonathan, thank you both so much for coming on. We could have talked for hours. This is just a very brief thing. Please do find them on social media. They're both doing fantastic work. Thanks everyone for watching, as always, and I will see you on Tuesday. Thank you.